Tower Hamlets Pupil Referral Unit. I was the head of inclusion there across the PRU for 10 years. And then I left Tower Hamlets PRU and I went back to mainstream. I was deputy head at Thomas Teller School in Greenwich for 5 years. And I've always been especially interested from the mainstream leadership days in specialist practices and how we might bring them into, I guess, the mainstream of school for all students, for all staff. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Peter, Tracy, it's good to see you both again. Becky, David, Diane, a big warm welcome. My house is too noisy with my 3 young children to take the call at home this evening. So if my internet is a little bit patchy, it's because I'm working at the local gym and not at home. But you do what you must when you're a working parent. I'm the head of partnerships at The Difference. Essentially, as Peter, you will have seen, I work to bring schools into our courses and to engage with the work that we do, which we'll talk more about as we go through. But I was a primary school head teacher up until 3 years ago, and I led a school from inadequate to good. Becky, a bit like you're describing, I did have an additionally resource provision at that time for children with autism. And I have used more informal internal APs as part of that journey. So I would love to connect and talk more about what you're working on at the minute as we go through too. But let's kick off with a little bit about who The Difference are and what we actually do. So The Difference was formed from a piece of research way back in 2017 now, where Kieran Gill, who is our CEO and still our CEO today, she did a piece of research into school exclusion. That piece of research found some statistics which most school leaders knew kind of informally but didn't have numbers to back up it. So if you're excluded from school, you're more likely to be from a certain racial demographic, you're more likely to be interacting with social care, you're more likely to have a mental health issue at some stage during your teenage years. And rather than walk away from that piece of research, Kieran decided that she would do something about it. She would fundraise and potentially put programs into action, which would then tackle some of the issues and help to reduce exclusions, avoidable exclusions. Sean and I will always kind of kick off these webinars and anytime we're presenting to say that we're not fully against school exclusions. We recognise that they have a place within the school. They're part of an array of tools which school leaders have, and Sean will touch a bit more on that as we go through, but I think it's really important to say from the outset as we go to the next slide, Sean. So there's 3 main activities that we do as an organisation, as a charity organisation: program professional development, practice and research, and policy and influencing. So we've got 2 courses. One of the courses that you'll hear a little bit about today is the Inclusive Leadership course. We also have a course called the Difference Leadership Programme. I'm not sure if you want to put that slide up actually, Sean, and I'll come back to those 3. The Inclusive Leadership course I'll let Sean explain, so I won't touch too much on that at the moment, but the Difference Leadership Programme, we would take leaders from mainstream settings, so primary and secondary settings, and they would spend 2 years working in alternative provision. So working with the most vulnerable pupils, sometimes special schools as well, Becky, you'll be interested here. And over the course of that 2 years, myself, Sean, the other members of our program team, we deliver training, we support them with regular tutor visits in school, with the idea at the end of the 2-year program, they'd return to a mainstream setting and would act as a kind of fountain of inclusive practice and help to reduce exclusions in that mainstream setting there. Let's move on, Sean. And that program work kind of links to the other 2 pillars quite nicely. We also have a practice and research team who take the learning of our program team, develop case studies, and essentially their aim is to share what works. And then that then feeds into the policy and influencing team, and we hope and aim to influence organisations like Ofsted, the DfE, kind of governing bodies, to think more closely about inclusion and its role in school improvement, its role in what's valued by school leaders, its role as a mechanism for improving our schools as well, where traditionally that's been more academically focused in terms of attainment. We think that inclusion has a huge part to play in school improvement in all schools too. And that segues into what Sean's about to share with you now.
Thanks so much, Jamie. So at The Difference, we have developed 3 core principles of school inclusion, and they underpin all the work that we do with schools and school leaders. including the inclusive leadership course. Those principles are, first of all, that all children have learning, well-being and safeguarding needs. The second is that relationships are integral to learning. And the third is that leading practice and system development is key to whole school inclusion. And I'm going to introduce those principles just in a little bit more detail, one by one, if that's okay. So first principle, all children have learning, well-being and safeguarding needs. Our framework for inclusion that underpins the course is built up from a universal foundation that recognises the needs of every student. So it doesn't see inclusion as either the peripheral support that we offer to just a minority of students. It doesn't see it as only contained in that learning strand, and instead it challenges what I think is quite a problematic notion that normal equals no needs. And we introduced this framework in the first session. It's the focus of the first assignment the leaders take away, and they find it a really valuable opportunity to review their school's inclusion offer. Looking for gaps potentially in their universal offer, and also thinking about how the offer is different for students with no needs compared to those with emerging needs. A central strand of the whole course is supporting leaders to develop the breadth and the depth of their universal inclusion offer for every student with all staff. We're not going to do this now because we don't quite have time, but you can take these slides away, and potentially if you were sharing them with colleagues, there's a few of these reflection questions that might be interesting to consider, and when you're thinking about whether this is a course that could be useful to you. The second principle is that relationships are integral to learning. None of you, none of me and my team or any of the students in our school can effectively process, sequence or recall, essentially learn, unless we feel safe. Dysregulated behaviours of everyone, all adults, all children, are rooted in unsafe experiences. And by developing the relational practice of all staff, we can initiate and grow and repair relationships that reduce dysregulation and improve feelings of safety, not just for students, but also for staff, that create optimal conditions for them. Building specific relational practices is not a radical or a progressive classroom approach. It's not an either or binary alternative to high standards and aspirational expectations. The approach you're taking to teaching and learning in your school, quality relationships are core. And at the difference, we focus on 7 different relational practices in the inclusive leadership course and support their introduction in school for 2 important reasons. First reason is that until these practices are personally meaningful to you as a leader, it's not possible to recognize where and how they can support improvement in your school, and it's definitely possible for you to make them accessible and meaningful to your staff. And secondly, these are practices that have their origins in specialist interventions delivered by specialist staff, and we want to take the opportunity through the course to reframe them as universal practices, not specialist, for every child and all staff, and think about how we can integrate these practices into the tier 1 offer for all students, as well as targeted interventions. And there are a couple of reflection questions there to think about in relation to these 7 relational practices, some of which might be familiar, some which might not be, some which you might feel quite positive about, some which maybe you don't, and that's totally fine, and some which you might also be quite interested in learning a bit more about and thinking about what they might bring to your school. And so the third principle that runs through the course is that leading practice and system development is key to whole school inclusion. And we can think of practice as the craft of our live interactions with children and adults, and systems as the deliberate steps that we build around those interactions. And to really get under the bonnet of key challenges and improve outcomes like exclusions or attendance, we need to explicitly separate practice and systems. To do that within Inclusive Leadership course, we work through 3 phases of implementing change with our leaders, in which this practice and system separation is really key. And the reason that is helpful, I think, is that in the face of big challenges, I sometimes see 2 approaches from opposite ends being chosen, like being the starting point for coming at those challenges. And one of those approaches is a sort of solving the problem one child at a time, most significant, most complex first, micro focus, and very understandable that's how you would, what would cause that's what would catch your attention, demand your attention, and what you would work your way through. And the other end is looking to do whole school transformative work, almost sort of all at once, sort of everything everywhere all at once. Let's all get trauma informed, kind of macro focused. Again, both these starting points are very understandable, but I don't think they are necessarily successful for delivering sustained improvement to whole school inclusion. So this practice in systems framework that runs through the sessions essentially tries to navigate or chart a third, more sort of a middle way, in which we're focusing on more effective and meaningful outcomes, identifying the interactions that drive those outcomes, and then delivering professional development in particular to improve those interactions, which can therefore be specifically relevant to each leader's school context. They're not generic and they're not bolt-on ideas. And we're just going to step briefly through each of those phases and just illustrate and think about what they look like. So when we think about exclusion and we think about what we know about exclusion, in some ways we know quite a lot. We know from research like Kieran's Making a Difference report that they most significantly affect children who have who have been impacted, who are more vulnerable and more disadvantaged. We also know that exclusions play a really important part in schools. They message core expectations and values. They demonstrate clear consequences for harmful and disruptive behaviours. They're important. And often the data that we see reported is for permanent exclusions, maybe suspensions, because that's what we count, and therefore that's what counts. And we see this kind of disproportionate data coming through that. However, permanent exclusions data is not always actually the most accurate measure of exclusion, because that data can be obscured by things like managed moves, internal exclusion, off-site suspension, all sorts of ways in which there's a lack of clarity in that data. So that's why on the Inclusive Leadership course, when we think about exclusion, we recognize that it exists across a whole continuum of sanctions. From permanent exclusion through managed move, time in AP, suspension, internal exclusion, detention, standing outside the classroom, losing your social time. All of them are useful and appropriate. And when we make each level of that continuum visible and measurable, we can identify emerging and unseen needs of individual children better. We can identify the most prevalent types of challenge we're facing, and we can identify locations, times of day, and staff who are most effective. And it's not just sanction exclusions which present valuable continuums that we can make use of. We also think about a continuum of self-exclusion or absence, and also a continuum of community exclusion or marginalisation. And these continuums really clearly illustrate for us opportunities that we have to reduce exclusion by reducing escalation up the ladder, improving reintegration back down from every level, and reducing repeat incidents that are recurring for those different outcomes. And it's always going to feel more urgent to focus on the top of each of those continuums. But there is arguably much greater value to be gained from focusing lower down, where the outcomes are relevant to more students and more staff, and where we can identify and engage earlier with emerging and unseen needs. And so a key component for all the leaders on the Inclusive Leadership course is identifying and tracking a priority outcome across the year and applying learning from the course to improve that. And there's a reflection question for you to think about there afterwards in relation to those continuums. So second phase after outcomes is interactions. Systems are useful. Systems are great at mapping accountability and lots of other organizational functions. But there's a misplaced belief that systems drive outcomes, and therefore the solution to complex problems lies in tweaking or reforming the systems that sit behind them. But actually, systems do not drive outcomes. It's interactions, real, live, daily interactions, which actually drive outcomes. And if we want to improve outcomes, we have to improve the interactions that drive them. But before we can do that, we actually have to identify which is the key interaction that is driving that outcome that we want to improve. And that's where on the course, we use the expertise and experience of the leaders in the room who know their students and their staff best to inform our understanding and highlight the interactions that they actually want to focus on to change the outcome that they are trying to improve. And once they have got an outcome that they're focusing on and they have interactions that they have identified, they are in a position to, first of all, really dig into the practice and the systems around that interaction. What does it look like now? What is it? What is the reason that it is delivering an outcome that actually at the minute is not where we want it to be? And then what do I want that interaction to look like? How will I use the different practices, the relational practices from the course to start reimagining that interaction? And once I know what I want it to look like, I'm in a position to plan the professional development journey and some system development for my staff and my school to actually improve that interaction. And that might involve scaffolding or scripting of the practice so that staff can evolve their craft, their practice, and develop what they want to develop that for their staff. I'm going to pause there for a second because I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who's head teacher at Berwick Academy and up in North Tyneside. And Tracy's on our Inclusive Leadership course in Newcastle, and she is going to tell you a bit more about her experience when I managed to stop presenting. Tracy, over to you to tell you a little bit about your experience on the Inclusive Leadership course this year.
Yeah, and
oh, you just muted yourself, Tracy, sorry.
Can you hear me now? Apologies, that's me putting my notes on top of the mute button. So yeah, good evening everyone. I am head teacher of Berwick Academy. We're in Northumberland, so we are don't worry, we are the most northerly town in England, and we are a walled community, a very rural community, and a very isolated community. So our nearest largest town is 50 miles away in both north and south directions. So we are quite on our own. We are the only secondary provision in the area for children to come to who live in our catchment, although some children do cross the border to Scotland and go where. The school has been through quite significant changes, and we came out with special measures 2 years ago. And when I originally joined the school, I didn't join as head teacher. I actually joined as an English teacher who had previously been in senior leadership, and I won't bore you with an entire tale of that, but had come into a school that was quite frankly dangerous. And I'd never seen anything like it. And I worked in the heart of Sunderland. I'd worked in, you know, some really inner city challenging schools, and it was in a very difficult position. And the reason I'm giving you that context is because to get that school safe, we had to take some absolutely drastic action. And I took over the leadership of the school, and we had to pull it together. And we did put in some really clear systems and processes because of where we were. That was really important for us. However, what has happened, and it's been quite a reflection, and I'm not saying this is something, I'm not preaching to anyone, I'm not saying this is what you need to do, I'm saying this is what we have done, and this is what has worked or is beginning to work for us. So we had continued down that road of, you know, policy, process, etc., and we have begun to see the relationships that we had formed positively with our children beginning to break, particularly after COVID. And we were beginning to see a decline in engagement, and a decline in engagement with staff, and a real brittleness coming back into the school. And we knew we had to do something, but we didn't know what. There was another imperative. We're going 2-tier. We are currently 3-tier. We're going 2-tier, and we are going to be opening a social, emotional, mental health base within our school. We have to shift, we have to change. And then we got some really stark student voice, which told us that our students, from our students' perspectives, they didn't think we cared about them. And we actually cared very deeply about them. Whether that was true or not was irrelevant. It was their perception. So it sort of sets the school in a context of something had to shift. And me and another senior leader attend, and I'm probably at this end of the spectrum of, yes, you follow the rules, you do this, and she's very much at the other end of the spectrum where she is fully trauma informed, and that's worked beautifully because somewhere we've pulled into the middle. And going on this course has allowed both of us to reflect on our own practices and start to think about, okay, so what does need to shift? How do we rebuild those relationships, but what can we practically do? And the course has provided us with a stepped process through that. And that has been really important because it's taken our thinking in a very well thought out and well structured way where we have been challenged without us feeling really uncomfortable, without us putting up the barriers of, I don't want to listen to this. It's been that really effective challenge over time where we've listened, we've gone back, we've talked, we've gone back to school, and we've been taken on this journey, and we are beginning now to implement some real practical steps. So linking to that thing that Sean was talking about policy, we've had another look at our policy, but basically our policy is fine. Our behaviour policy is fine because we're not really interested in that process. That's there to catch things. That's there to deal with certain issues, certain things. But our practice and what we've decided to talk about is this whole thing around developing the relational practice of staff, but it become personally meaningful for us. And that was a real key turning point. And we are beginning that as leaders now, and then we will trickle that through into staff. That once you have this relational interaction with students, you actually prevent them from going into the behaviour policy. Not all the time. We still exclude, we still have those expectations, there are still sanctions for behaviours that happen, but it is the comeback and conversation or the preempting of that we do. And the way we have chosen to do this is starting really, really small with some really small changes, but meaningful adjustments to our interactions and our practices. And we started with this idea that interventions and interactions are not rewards. And that was a massive change for us. So we continue to reward children, but that's not the biggest reward. And research tells you that rewards don't work to change behaviors, but interactions and interventions do, because a recognition of a change in behavior actually works wonders for children, and it can be reflected in interactions and interventions. So we are beginning to develop our own practice around that and model that across the school. So all of our senior leaders now model that across the school in interactions with young people. And we don't lower our standards. What we are modeling is how we want that interaction to have. So we have scripts that we've developed, and we are replanning the implementation of those strategies around scripts, around removing barriers to success for young people, teaching young people how we want them to be. So how do we want them to be a student? How do we want them to be in the corridor? How do we want them to be with each other? So we are taking all of those principles and modeling them to groups and looking at, is that making a difference? And I have to say, it has made a significant difference, and we are at the start of our journey with our children. But I think that one of the biggest things that was said the other day to me by a child was, "Hey, miss, you've really chilled out, haven't you?" And that conversation that I then had, I just thought, wow, that's actually quite a reflection back at me around, they were seeing the real me and not a tense sort of people who were trying to hold the school together. That is really important, considering we are going to be taking on some of the most vulnerable students in our community who are currently having to travel 30, 40 miles in taxis because there is no provision in Berwick for them. We've got to make that provision, so we've got to develop our practice. And what we want to come out of this is that the interactions that staff and students begin to have are interactions that engage in learning. And for us, that was the key, that the difference comes with. It's not about saying, well, you've got this inclusive practice and it sits over here, and then the learning and education and academia sit over here, and sort of there's this gap between them. It's a fully integrated practice, but there are small steps you take through it. I'm hoping that it does make that biggest difference before we begin to go two-tier, because if we can get that in place now, when that big shift comes, I think it is actually going to make what we do successful. So I think if I was to take anything away from it, it was, and you know, Sean knows I've said this, I was the open-minded skeptic in the room, and I was probably the person sitting there going, yeah, okay. Right. And we've moved so far beyond that, because it is that notion of, this is not preaching, this is not saying you need to do this. This is about what will work in your context, in your school, to engage young people who we all know nationally are presenting issues from COVID that we probably haven't seen the intensity of before. So our mantra is around just what Sean said. It is around changing the craft of our practice in the interactions we have with young people. And if we keep that as our mantra, we know that that is the solid foundation from which we build. And then we build that for our context and our strategies.
Tracy, thank you. Thanks so much for finding time to come and share, and also for some really, I guess, personal sharing of your journey through this, and how that connects to the school's journey. The things that I heard, just to reflect back as well, in part, was that there's no quick instant fix to any of this work, and that leaders' expertise and confidence and personal confidence is really key, particularly if you want to model and develop a practice for your staff which is homegrown and which is going to be sustainable you know, a long time after the sort of initial bit of doing some CPD, and that is driving towards success in the classroom for all students, and not a separation of that work into kind of just what we do when things go wrong and then in a classroom. Thank you very, very much. Does any, I mean, it might be because I've got a couple of case studies to show, and we've got a little bit to go afterwards to just sort of talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the course. But does anybody want to ask a question? Any questions for Tracy? Because otherwise, I think you should definitely have permission to head off, Tracy, while we finish off. Yeah, any questions for Tracy before she heads off? Peter?
Not a question, just thank you. Very interesting.
You're welcome. Very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Great, lovely. Well, I am very grateful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks to have session number 5. Yeah, back up north.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Okay, I am going, if that's all right, to go back here and press on. Yeah, just got a little bit more to kind of share, but then hopefully he's going to wrap up and talk a bit more about the actual sort of nuts and bolts of the course. But 2 quick case studies, which I suppose partly mirror and back up what Tracy was saying, and they also highlight this model that we were talking about. Actually, not that model. This model talking about thinking about how we can realistically start to develop homegrown contextual practice in schools that pick some big ideas from big kind of, you know, relational practices that feel maybe quite heavy, but actually creates a route into them for staff that is much more meaningful and accessible. So Jodie, exec head at Greenwich Primary School, her headline outcome she was really interested in last year was attendance, as with probably lots of you. She chose to make her kind of feeder outcome she focused on was a group of students who were just below persistent absence. And the interaction that she decided to focus on was the first interaction that they had with every adult when they came back from a period of absence, even if that was just a day. And she looked at what that was like currently, and she saw quite a lot of deficit-based kind of what they were missing, what was wrong with them in terms of not coming in, and a lack of, I guess, compassion for the anxiety and the dysregulation that some of those students were bringing. And Jodie was really interested in our asset-based practice and our compassionate minds practice. And so she took that, she introduced them to staff, but she specifically focused them in on that interaction around returning from absence. And staff co-created scripts, a bit like what Tracy was just talking about. They co-created scripts for those interactions and set about using them for a term. And a few things happened across the rest of that year. Number one, Jodie would hold that, and that group of PA students, none of them became PA, but also attendance improved. And in part, Jodie would say that is because this work didn't just with that group of students, it became part of everyday practice for all staff around students and their attendance. But it also, Jodie saw it spreading into lots of other areas that weren't just about attendance, and they weren't being directed to take this practice elsewhere, but the confidence and the success they had in quite a boundaried way allowed them to take that craft into other sorts of interactions. Second other case study is from Habib. It's deputy head at a big secondary in Enfield, Aylwood. It's an AET school. they were in the top 10% of suspenders in 2021, and he chose, that was his headline outcome, was suspension, but he was really interested lower down on his continuum, on his ladder, thinking about repeat internal exclusions, that if they were able to tackle the repeat internal exclusions were the ones that were ultimately feeding up and becoming much more regular suspensions. And when he looked at the interaction, which he thought was key to that, which is what happens when students came back to meet with, inter-class with teachers where there'd been repeat internal exclusions, what he saw was a current interaction that was reset but had no repair. So by that, what he would say is there was very clear, do you know what you did wrong? Do you know why it was wrong? Do you know what will happen if you do it again? Nothing wrong with that. You know, it's a regulation kind of, reset, but there was no repair. And he was really interested in restorative practice that was reparative, and also zones of regulation as an extension of trauma-informed practice. And so he set out, particularly first of all, to deliver zones of regulation to the whole school. So it's a big secondary school, and every single student in that school now has a kind of zones of regulation understanding. It's part of their planner. They do work on it in tutor period every lesson, and they'll do it when they come back in for lunch at the start of afternoon lessons as well with different teachers. So that piece of work, plus work around restorative practice, he built into new scripts and scaffolds for those interactions for children coming back after repeat suspensions. And it had a really, really significant impact on the success of those interactions not escalating into further suspensions. And you can see his suspensions are now very, very low. That when I went in just before February half term, after February half term, beginning of this half term, they were on 13 for this year. And it isn't because he's buried them all in internal exclusion. He's keeping a very close track on internal exclusion. That's his focus outcome for this year. But that has dropped, and he really wants that to drop lower for this year. That's his focus on trying to reduce that and think about what are the interactions driving the bulk of internal exclusions that they have currently. And so 2 case studies following that model, and in particular thinking about how we can take big relational practice ideas, but bring them into interactions that are much more relevant to all staff, lots of students, that they can do every single day and get better at. Yeah, so kind of we started in terms of my input. We've got these 3 principles that underpin what we do at The Difference, but particularly the Inclusive Leadership course, and they are supported by these 3 implementation phases, so that we can take the learning from and the expertise from those relational practices, actually make them part of a plan, put initially, as Tracy was saying, for her, and for her own kind of journey and learning, but ready to start thinking about, well, how will I bring my staff on that journey as well? Jamie, over to you. Just say wrap up and just say tell everyone something about a bit more about the Inclusive Leadership course, its structure, how it works, etc.
Yeah, I want to keep it pretty snappy, so there's time for a couple of questions if we've got time. But essentially, the course runs 1 day every half term, so 6 sessions across the year, and obviously we've rattled through quite a lot in the last kind of 45 minutes just there, but by having a day at a half term, it gives space to discuss the content with other people from other schools. As Tracy indicated there, she's from quite a rural school, but one of the blessings of the course is being able to work with other school leaders from other phases, so it's a mix of primary and secondary schools learning from each other from different contexts. Often you'll find people with very similar contexts and issues to your own, so there's lots of learning from schools, and we find that lots of kind of within that kind of network of who's in the cohort, visits to other schools, relationships with other school leaders, learning from other school leaders kind of happens quite organically coming out of those learning days and those 6 days across the year. In terms of impact, we've got lots of stats in the middle column there about the impact of the course. So 53% of the schools reported a reduction in external and internal exclusion, which against the national backdrop of a huge rise in exclusions, we are impressed with that as a statistic and hope to see that increase further. 87% of schools have seen an improved de-escalation of behaviour incident, a bit like Tracy described in terms of like the relationships driving the interactions that happen in the school, and that leads to that promising outcome. And 82% of people who are on the course spread and cascaded that CPD throughout their setting too. So why don't we skip to the next slide? Sean was just kind of rattle through. Sean kind of set out the relational practices that we touched on across the course, but I think it's important to say that rather than just treat these as buzzwords, which is happening in lots of schools across the country at the minute, oh, we're a trauma-informed school, oh, we're an asset-based school, it's getting under the hood of what good practice looks like in your school, in your setting, and in other settings as well too. So each of those relational practices is giving space across those 6 days, as well as, you might well be interested in this, David, the final session thinks very closely about what effective whole school internal AP looks like, and how those kind of relational practices can then therefore build and flow through your internal AP into the wider school community as well. So thinking about internal AP, yes, as a mechanism for those children who need it, but as also as a kind of a tool for supporting inclusion across the whole school as well. I think that's it from me. Sean, is there one more slide to look at in terms of next steps and talk about next steps?
Yes, there is. I think the only thing that I would add in there, just because and we might get a question about it, is just about the assignments, and that the assignments are very, very practical. They're not compulsory, but we have quite a high return rate given that they're not compulsory of 60%. But they are designed so that if you have got a lot out of the session and you want a way of taking that back and doing something practical in your school, they're there. And then we bring what people have done in their assignments into the next session. And there is sharing and presentation of what you have learned and what you've done as the beginning of each of the sessions. Yeah, next steps.
So yeah, essentially, drop me an email is pretty much the gateway to all the next steps. If you're a MAT or a local authority leader, then definitely drop me an email and share some kind of information that you've received tonight. Maybe share the slides with colleagues in your school. If you're a head teacher, again, decide who the right person in your school might be to be on the course. And we do offer a heavy discount on a second place, and we find that it's often very strong if a head teacher comes with an assistant head or a deputy head in the school to then get that kind of meaningful impact too. And if you're a senior leader, yeah, put pressure on your head teacher to let you come on the course too. There are other ways to get involved with the difference, the internal AP network, which I linked in the chat there. But I'll be sending a follow-up email to all of you who are here today with some more information. Would love to reach out and have kind of an individual discussion about what's going on in your school, what you might need for your school, where your school might be at in particular journeys around internal AP, SEN needs, inclusion needs, and things like that. So I'll definitely drop everyone an email tomorrow just to kind of touch base and follow up on that. Which probably gives us, we're slightly over the time we said, but if anyone had any questions, we'd absolutely love to hear them now.
Jamie, whilst we do this as well, will you drop a link to the slides in the chat in